Let's hear it for technology fails. We're going to cut this first part out, even though we're live right now. Here we go. This is the eLearn Podcast. If you're passionate about the future of learning, you're in the right place. The expert guests on this show provide insights into the latest strategies, practices, and technologies for creating killer online learning outcomes. My name's Laddick, and I'm your host from OpenLMS. The eLearn Podcast is sponsored by eLearn Magazine, your go-to resource for all things online learning. Click-by-click how-to articles, the latest in EdTech, spotlight on successful outcomes and trends in the marketplace. Subscribe today and never miss a post at elearnmagazine.com. And OpenLMS, a company leveraging open source software to deliver effective, customized, and engaging learning experiences for schools, universities, companies, and governments around the world since 2005. Learn more at openlms.net. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the eLearn Podcast. My name's Laddick, and today I have none other than Miss Lizard, which I'm super psyched to have on the show here. Actually, her name's Abby Cooke, and Abby, like, where do I find you sitting other than in a room with lots of books? I'm assuming that's not virtual. That looks real.
No, these are all very real books that you can pick up with nice. a real fake lizard.
I love it.
So this is my studio. I am in Richmond, Virginia. You can't see it, but behind me or behind my camera is a wall of what I call 10,000 hobbies, because I like to pick up new hobbies and then I put them down and I pick up new ones. So this is the room where that happens.
I'm forever jealous. People who've been listening to me podcast for a while now know that my family has the champagne problem of moving around the world every couple of years. And so I don't get to have like a shed or, a closet. Like basically, we get to have an apartment wherever we go. And so I don't get to have that place where I can just lay down my hobbies and whatnot. So that sounds fun. Fantastic. Excellent. Abby, I know you are a trainer, you're a consultant. You are known to many in the world as Miss Lizard on TikTok and whatnot. You like to talk about science. You like to talk about training and learning and these kinds of things, but give us the 60 to 90 seconds on yourself so that we kind of can set the stage.
Okay, so I technically have two jobs right now. I am a learning and digital collaboration manager for a company called Southern States, but I also have a consulting business, and that is Lizard Brain Learning, and that's where the TikTok account comes in, and that's also where the love of data science and the love of learning science really comes in, and that's mostly what I talk about. And occasionally, if something just interests me, I'll throw that up there on the TikTok as well.
I think that's the whole point of it, isn't it? I mean,
I did a couple of videos about early mammals because I just got really excited about early mammals, and I did a couple of videos just showing pictures of early mammals, saying, "Look at this guy; he looks like a unicorn." So that was fun.
Didn't we just discover something like some new early mammal? Anyway, then we don't have to go down that piece right there. We're here to talk today about something that is near and dear to my heart. I find super fascinating, and I'm so glad that you have put this topic on the table, which is why do we continue to believe in pseudoscience after we've seen and been presented with clear evidence that it doesn't, it's not true. Mm-hmm. And I always refer to this as my favorite way to think is math from the gut. Right. Where it's like, hey, I think that's going to be 33, or something, where it's, and so many managers, so many other business owners, so many people in the world. I know we all do it. It's, I think that's like 45%, we kind of just throw
it just feels right. That number
just feels right. That, somewhere, all that collection of stuff, it just feels right. Start us off with defining what do you call pseudoscience, and maybe give us a couple of examples of that.
Sure. So I use the term pseudoscience very, very broadly in this context. I don't just mean things that are kind of established that you can go Google, and when you take a closer look at the research, it's not true. I also like to call them like the Facebook facts or the memes that people show you, things like, well, a bumblebee technically can't fly, those types of things that when you take a deeper dive, you find out that that's not true, that bumblebees are actually perfectly capable of flying. So when I say pseudoscience, I mean anything that gets passed around as fact And usually when somebody like myself brings up, "Well, actually, that's not true. They're called a buzzkill," or, "Why do you have to ruin the fun?" Or, "I was really enjoying liking that story, and you came in and ruined it by
Mhm.
pushing your glasses up on your nose and saying that it wasn't true."
Do you revel in that, or do you find that you you
Not at
you
all.
no,
Not at all. I don't enjoy it. But I do enjoy
Mm,
truth, and I
mm,
enjoy knowing the truth about things, and so my goal is never to take joy away from people. I don't enjoy that at all, but my goal is to make sure that we're all passing around accurate information, especially because as learning professionals, whatever we say gets passed around, whatever we disseminate gets spread, and so we want to make sure that what we're saying is the most accurate it can be.
sure, 100%. What is there a difference between pseudoscience and what I guess I would say is conventional wisdom, or, things that we rely upon on a regular basis, like and now I'm completely failing on a particular example here about, the way the seasons change on a regular basis, or, just sort of like, something that you'd say you think about, a farming community, and it's like, "Oh, that's just gonna we just know that that's when you go get the pumpkins out of the field because that's conventional wisdom." Or are those could those be one and the same?
They could be. The way I like to look at it is conventional wisdom can be true. We just
Mm,
don't know because we haven't researched it.
mm,
Things like we know that it's going to rain because your shoulder is swelling up and hurting. Like that is perfectly possible to be true, even though that's a folk wisdom. Because if we were to test it, if we were to say, okay, let's document when your shoulder's hurting and see if it's raining after that, and then we have some data for it.
right.
So, I would say that conventional wisdom isn't necessarily false. It's not necessarily bunk. It means that we don't know because we haven't examined it very closely.
Mm. So before I pick your brain about why we continue to believe this stuff, even though what is your favorite piece of pseudoscience? Like, what's the
Okay, so I'm gonna share an anecdote because this anecdote is actually what inspired my talk on this at the ATD conference and expo. So I was meeting with a head of sales and we were building like a sales enablement piece and we were talking about everything we wanted to include. And he said that he wanted to include a statistic that we can speak something like 150 words a minute, but that we can only process a quarter of that.
hmm,
And he said, it was a statistic I heard and I want to include it. And in my brain, like it tingled the spider sense a little bit. And I was
mm,
thinking like, A, I've heard that before and I thought it was the other way around, that we actually can process way more than we can speak. And two, it sounded folksy. It sounded very so I
yeah,
just I said to him, I said, "You know what? Yeah, absolutely. Let me just make sure those numbers are correct before we include it." So I did some Googling and I did some digging. And what I was finding everywhere I looked, one, everyone had a different number.
mm,
But it was the reverse of it, so that we speak something like 125 to 150 words a minute, but we process more than that. But I was seeing like we process 300 words a minute, 400. One article even said 800 words a minute that we can process. But nobody listed a source of where
mm,
these numbers came from. And I was looking at all of these articles trying to find where these numbers came from. And I finally found an article that had a source on it. And I clicked on it and I have to show you what I found. I apologize for people who are only just listening because I have to describe what I'm about to show you.
of
And
course.
and my husband has since bought me a print copy of this because it's just fabulous. Um,
Okay, I gotta
it's
see
a
this.
it's a piece called "Listening is a 10-Part Skill" from 1957. Here is the little
And for
publishing
those yeah, for
fact.
those who can't see this, if you're listening to the podcast right now, it literally, it's got 2 cartoon figures on it that you would expect to see in a Tom and Jerry,
It's very, yeah,
cartoon,
like
yeah, like 1950.
old-timey and, like, drawings, so the statistic in question is on the final page, and, here it is. There's a man here thinking of a pretty lady, and, it says in here, "There's good evidence that if thought were measured in words per minute, most of us could think easily about 4 times the rate of 125 words a minute." So Thus, we normally have about 400 words of thinking time to spare during every minute a person talks to us. But it still doesn't say how that number was arrived
I
at.
was just
This
gonna say there's
still
so he
doesn't
says so he
say
says
how anything.
there's good evidence, but we don't get the good evidence.
And I sat looking at this thinking every article I looked at, every single like well-respected publication that I was looking at. These are well-known places. This is what they were citing. This little like half-page tabloid folded publishing tract with this number in it that we don't know where it came from. And it inspired the because I started thinking like, well, how do I go about talking about this? How do I go back and say, I don't know if this is something we can include or can we? I mean, maybe we can, but we have to be honest about where we're finding this sort of stuff. That's my
Mhm.
favorite. That's my favorite anecdote. So,
Wow, I feel like that's got to be. I feel like there's a whole bunch of people who need to have PhDs who could use that as their research question. No, I love it. That's absolutely fantastic. Do you think that? So, okay, obviously we're not going to name names of these well-known publications who perpetuated this without probably ever knowing where it came from, right?
mhm.
We're going to assume again, this is a precursor to our why we continue to believe this stuff. But what's the impetus behind that? Is just it's the pressure to publish, it's the speed of the cycle that we need to create content. Like, have you done any deeper dive on like the why are things perpetuated, or maybe I just fell right into the conversation of why do we keep believing these things?
Well, yeah, I think you dipped a toe in it, but I think it's kind of all of that. It is because any business now has to have a social media presence. They have to have a blog. They have to have a YouTube channel or a TikTok channel or both. They have to be on Twitter or Threads and they have to have a LinkedIn presence because they have to create that brand gravity. And so they're churning out so much content. So part of it is the need for speed. I think part of it too is just it's a number we hear from other reputable sources, and so we think it's reputable, and so we
Mm,
use it, but they think we're a reputable source, and so we
mhm.
use it, and it sort of perpetuates itself because if it's something that everybody says, well, then it must be true because, like, these guys who are way smarter than me are saying it, but they might be thinking the same thing about me. Probably not the smart part, but they
Yeah.
probably think that we're all saying it because it's well-established fact, but is it? We
Mhm.
don't know until somebody takes a look and does some Googling for
Again,
the
I
source.
love we've come to this or we've danced around this particular topic in several other episodes on this podcast around, the need, because we have a moment right now in our universe where um, higher education in general, but it's just sort of the whole entire learning process is not under siege, but is definitely undergoing those kind of one of those who are we moments because of generative AI, because of the pandemic, because of so many other things. We just stumbled into a moment where it's like we definitely need to have sources of the truth that we can trust,
Mhm,
right? And
mhm.
so do we go back to the true, like, okay, here's a research college or institute of higher education, and we can name that as a resource we can trust? I don't know. I'll leave that out there.
Well, and that's a tough like, that's a $1,000,000 question because, that's what peer review is for,
Right.
but then you find stories about people who, like, well, I forget who it was, but they kept getting solicitations from a publication to publish a paper in it. And he just wrote a paper that said, "Take me off of your mailing list," over and over and over and over again. He had graphs that said, "Take me off your mailing list," and the caption said, "Take me off your mailing list," and they published it. It's a peer-reviewed journal, and that's now a cited paper. That's a paper that people cite because it's out there. And so, do we create peer review of the peer review? I mean, how many layers do we need to
Wow.
do to establish what but I agree. It's a huge problem and we also have a problem with um are you familiar with the term the replication crisis, which
I am
is
not. No,
okay, so the
you're the first
replication
one to put
crisis
that on the first one to put that on my desk.
this is something that, in the past, like, 10 years, and probably other places are realizing that they have a bit of a problem with a lot of studies that were used to cite aspects of psychology, trying to
Mm.
replicate them and realizing that they're not
Oh, okay. So
replicating.
basically the repeatability of a outcome or of
Mhm.
a an experiment or a study. Now I didn't know it was called the replication
Yeah.
process.
So, yeah, but anyway, so like a lot of these studies that you see in articles and stuff that are really fun, swearing means you're more intelligent, you have a bigger vocabulary. That was one study and it hasn't replicated yet. And so when we have all of the stuff that we establish as truth, but when we realize like, oh, we tried to do it again and it didn't get the same result, um, that's tough too, because articles in that demand for content will pull up a study and go, "Oh, look at this. It's statistically significant." And we run with it. And we publish an article on it saying, "Swearing means you're more intelligent." And as much as we would all like that to be true, um, we don't know yet because we've only got the one.
100%. 100%. I'm gonna go the other side to it. And so now let's take it to the pseudoscience,
Mhm.
and even because what I find really interesting is pseudoscience can bleed into marketing messages, can bleed into, yeah, brand, uh, messaging or
Mhm.
these different kinds of things. And I'm going to preface this, entering into this part of our conversation with this. My family and I, we like to listen to a podcast called Science Versus, and one of the ones that we just listened to recently was about skincare products, about anti-aging skincare products. And I love that they went through and actually looked at all of the research on what actually creates a difference in your skin, and they couldn't find anything except for there's one active ingredient that actually makes any
Mhm.
sort of difference, and it's like such a minuscule difference. And yet, I go into any mall here where I live, or where, I'm sure you do the same thing there in
Mhm.
Virginia and whatnot, and you're just bombarded with hundreds and hundreds of products and brands that say, no, this makes a difference, even though we know it's not true. So now
Mhm.
take me there, Ms. Lizard. Why do we continue to believe pseudoscience when we have facts, when we know? Is it because we just don't know the real facts? Is it because we're unwilling to see through it? Is it because it makes us feel better to believe what we think is true?
The answer is D, all of the above. So the way when I talk about pseudoscience and our unwillingness to see past it, I talk a lot about the lizard brain, and that's where my company's namesake came from.
Sure.
Is that, and we don't actually have a lizard brain. I want to be very clear that's an out
That's
of
also
date.
pseudoscience.
It
It's
is the idea that we had a lizard brain. It was a mental model called the triune brain that a lot of people said like our brain evolved around it as we became human. That's not true either.
oh no.
So it's a perfectly appropriate name, but I think that the term lizard brain is still useful as a construct to talk about the way we evolved and the world that we evolved into, because our brain is pretty much unchanged from how it was 35,000 years ago. We hit basically where we are, and that's where we've been. And 35,000 years sounds like a long time, but it is not. Um, History of the world speaking. So 35,000 years ago, think about what the world was like and what we had to do to survive. And that's what our brain did. That's what our
Mhm.
brain did to survive. So we had to escape from predators, which meant that we had to watch out for change. We had to make sure that everything on the horizon looked good. We had to hang out with other folks. We had to be in social groups because we survived better when we were in groups than when we were alone. We also had better food and we paired with better mates when we had higher social status. And so
Mm.
our brain evolved to crave, belonging. Our brain evolved to crave high social status and emotional resonance. Emotional resonance was another thing that kept us alive because we could say, like, don't go in that cave. There's a bear in there. I had a
Mhm.
really emotionally resonant experience in that cave and it was very memorable for me. And I don't want you to get eaten by that bear. But emotional resonance also is what makes us care for our young. And so those things are all a part of pseudoscience. So when we're in a meeting, let's say, and somebody raises their hand and says, well, what if we identified everyone's learning style? And then somebody says, well, there's not a whole lot of research on learning styles that says it's effective. I have just injured that person's social status.
Mm.
I have possibly called into question experiences from their own identity of anything that they may have experienced with learning styles in the past. And I've clipped their wings a little bit with that emotional resonance. And so the brain doesn't like any of that. The brain does not like their social status being called into question, and the brain doesn't like that emotional resonance being shut off, and so the brain finds ways to not have to deal with it. If you can go look up studies that show when we are told we're wrong, when we are proven incorrect about something, there are centers of our brain that light up that are the same as when we experience physical pain.
Oh, sure. Mhm.
We don't feel physical pain, but there's a part of our brain that doesn't know the difference, and we evolved to get away from that because that's what kept us alive, and so when that lights up, our brain will find a way to get away from it, and even if
Mm.
that means, like, if you told me that I was incorrect about something, I might find a way to not like you. I'd be like, "Look at him with his little black shirt and his neat haircut that's so, like, well sculpted." My brain will find a way to dislike the person that told me, so it's easier for me to disagree with them or to find ways to poke holes in what they said so that I can be, "Ah, I was clear. I was right the whole time, obviously."
Obviously,
Because that's
yeah.
mentally very comfortable. It's a mentally comfortable spot for us to be.
And so we choose that that space of comfortability, that space of essentially not being in harm's way or being harmed. We choose that over even when it's clearly nope, that the light is red. I should not push my gas pedal because the light is red. We choose that, and that we see that time and time again. Or like again, is there research behind this, or
Is there research behind, like,
our need for emotional resonance, our need for,
oh,
like
yeah.
that we will actually, people will actually, I mean, again, I would be remiss if I said, "Hey, I see it all the time." I literally talk to people all the time where I'm like, "Actually, no, I'm going to show you the real thing." And then they're like, "Yeah, but I don't," again, from the gut, I just don't think that's true.
Mhm.
Even though I'm like, "Here's the research. So, um, what I guess so, yeah, so we've got that backed up. We've got that, lots of
So, yeah,
psychological
and,
studies, yeah.
the term that you can use if you wanna search and read more about it is called the backfire effect, which
Hmm,
basically just means that if I say that I believe something and you tell me, "No, that's not true," and you show me research, the backfire effect means that I'm gonna go on believing it anyways, or I'm at least going to behave like I do. Um, and it's a well-documented phenomenon that happens with people, that we just dig our heels in harder, and it's because we are creatures of emotion. Any salesperson will tell you that. Like, they teach we don't buy on logic, we buy on
oh, no,
heart,
we
and
buy in
so
in our gut, yeah, we buy for because it feels right, and every
mhm.
sales, yeah, exactly, every salesperson. So, at what point will someone change their mind? At what does the science say about what should I do? And or, how could I differently present something in a different way? Or how
Mhm.
could I approach a situation in a different way? Or most importantly, like at what point would that person or that group of people make a shift to the reality rather than continuing to dig their heels in? So
Mhm.
I get those are two really big questions. I'm sorry. So,
No,
um,
and that like, honestly, if you could answer that question, I would go into business with you and we could make billions of dollars because
no
that's
one's done that science. No one's done
new.
that research.
Well, they have, but the solutions are ones that a lot of people aren't willing to do, which involves patience. Um,
Ah,
there's a piece.
being human, being a messy human. You're
I
saying,
wish
oh,
I
okay.
could remember the name of the woman who, did this research, but there's a concept called conversational receptiveness, which just basically means that when you are trying to convince someone of something, the best way to change their mind is to be totally willing to be changed by them first, to listen to what they have to say and to, um accept what they're saying as their valid feelings about something, and
Sure.
then presenting patience, patience, and more patience, and that's just something that, A, not a lot of us have in the working world, and B, a lot of people aren't willing to do, and
Mm.
why? Because it's work. It's a huge amount of mental work, and nobody likes doing mental work. I don't. That takes calories, and our brain doesn't wanna spend the calories, it's trying to save those.
Right, sure. I wanna point everybody else, If you're listening to this in a recording, or if you are, happen to be catching this at some other time, whether it's Chris is throwing up every single one of these things that you've put out there about conversational receptiveness and the backfire effect and whatnot in the links on LinkedIn and YouTube and whatnot. So I hope that people will go and check those out, because this is fascinating stuff. So
Huge shout out to
it
Chris.
sounds
Thank
to
you, Chris.
me like so much comes down to, man, I hate to say that we're on the same side of the table here, because then it sounds like we are,
Oh, I'm sure we can find something to disagree about.
no, but here's the thing. I don't necessarily want to be, right. I don't
Yeah.
want to be on a different side of the table, because I'm just like, what you've just identified is something that I've been preaching here on this podcast and whatnot for such a long time, that, the work of being a human is extremely messy and extremely difficult. And that's where we continue to fall short in so many things. I mean, we're doing this AI and learning summit, and that this is the flag I have posted in this whole thing is like, I don't care about any of the technology. Look at all the challenges. Every single one of the challenges we have out there is a human problem, right? Data bias, it's a human problem, right? The fact that we need to know where the answers come from, that's a human problem. The fact that when we're presented with difficult things about our jobs changing and our lives changing, those are human problems, and it gets messy and takes time and it's difficult. So that's a tough place to kind of find ourselves backed up against, or painted into that corner of, hey, if we want to do this right, it's just going to, we got to lift the weights.
I don't have anything out there about this. I think I made one TikTok video about it, but what I call it is good thinking posture, because good posture is something that you have to, like, yes, exactly, as we both sit up in our seats.
Every time my son says it to me, I'm like, oh my God. Okay, yes. So I will do.
But posture is very active in order to get it right. And it is just so easy to relax into that slump, and our brains do the same thing, because we want to fall into the um things are this simple. The latest one for me was talking about remote work with somebody, and a lot of people are on one side or the other about remote work, whether
Mm.
it's all good or all bad. And I'm challenging people to practice that good thinking posture and say, well, you're allowed to have a preference. Absolutely. You can have a preference about remote work, but it's okay to acknowledge that the other side is not 100% wrong.
Mhm.
Because remote work I was honestly probably never more mentally healthy in my work than when we moved remote. But people who are now being onboarded, who are just starting work, sitting by themselves at home, are not getting that incidental learning exactly
Mhm.
from people sitting around them. So there are benefits to both sides, and that's practicing that good thinking posture, because it's really easy to say, oh well, like, going back into the office is bad, or oh, remote
Well,
working is bad.
and even though, and I love, let's tease this out a little bit more. I love it's not the ignorance, it's the ignoring of, or the um failure to acknowledge what you just talked about 10 minutes ago, that we are social creatures, that we are, we're on this earth just like every other organism, right? And the ways that we communicate are so much more than just this word and this visual, right? We
Mhm.
have a couple other podcasts on here on the Inland Podcast where we talk with people who study the brain all the time.
Mhm.
And one of the key facts that one of these individuals, whose name, Chris, I hope that you'll put it out there again, his name, he's a professor up in Washington State. And he put on the show, he said, look, like, our brains are so attuned that when you and I are in the same room and we're talking with one another, our ears can actually measure the air pressure difference that happens in our conversation. And that's how we know when to respond. And so when that's taken away from us in this particular conversation,
Mhm.
our brain is literally freaking out right now, because we're like, okay, we kind of know when I'm going to pause, and you can hear those vocal cues, but a key piece of that physical interaction is missing.
Mhm.
And so as remote workers, one of the arguments for being together is just that you don't even know all of the different little buzz and energy and pheromones and pieces that you interact with your colleagues, right? So I don't know. I see. I'm all of this is to say, I completely agree with you that
Mhm.
that it's somewhere in the middle. But boy, is it hard to do that active listening. It's hard to do that.
It's work, and,
Yeah.
our brain needs calories and glucose to do that work, and again, 35,000 years ago, when you didn't know where those calories were gonna come from or where your next meal was gonna come from, you saved those calories. You didn't
Mm,
spend them. You saved the mental energy for hunting down your prey and making food out of it, and so our brain constantly wants to find shortcuts and ways to not have to think about something, and so, you know, if I go and show this publishing tract to head of sales and, laugh at it and say, "This is, pseudoscience and we're not gonna use it," he's gonna find ways to not like me so that
mhm,
he can continue to believe that statistic, and probably should, because I shouldn't be making fun of people, but that's, the other thing that I think is, that we need to address with pseudoscience and addressing pseudoscience with people is that a lot of the techniques from constructive criticism work well in here as well. So in constructive criticism, we address the behavior as opposed to the person. We say this action was not a good one as opposed to you're not a good person, and we need to do the same thing here. We don't call the person a liar, we don't call the person out of date, we call the statistic out of date
mhm,
because it was not that head of sales' fault. He was genuinely producing something that he thought was going to be helpful. He was actively trying to make a better learning experience. He can't be faulted for that. So we just have to say, "You know what? I did some digging. Those numbers, I couldn't find any accuracy on them. I wouldn't be comfortable using them." So
mhm.
that way it's not him that's on the table. It's the data.
Yeah, for sure. I wanna let everybody know that the podcast guest was John Medina, Professor John Medina up there in Washington State, just so everybody knows that I was just referring to. So, can we or, in your talk at ATD, did you come up with a sort of a conclusion, like a recipe of, "Hey, here's steps that you can take to identify, work through, and then maybe disabuse pseudoscience," or where did you leave it at the end there? Or do you have something like that where here's a formula I could follow to work with somebody, work with a team to say, hey, let's lift ourselves up.
So, I'll start off by saying what I started off with in that talk, which is that there's no cure for
Mm,
pseudoscience. There's only treatment, right? So there is no apply all that I can give anybody that anyone can give anyone that says do this and it'll fix it. There's only treatment, which means in the right dose to the right person at the right time,
mm,
consistently. Because if you don't apply the treatment regularly, then it goes back to being the way it was. So yes, there are things you can do. The constructive criticism piece is one that I talked about. I think the biggest thing you can do, and because we don't have control over how anybody else acts, right? We're only in control of what we do and how we act. And so the thing that I always tell people is, um, model accepting criticism gracefully, or model accepting correction gracefully. If that is what you want to see, then that is what you have to show. So the anecdote I always give, I've seen the movie Ghostbusters more times than most people have seen
one of the
movies
best ever.
total.
One of the best ever.
Um, if someone were to, in conversation, talk about Slimer the ghost and say that he's blue, there's a couple of ways I could react to that. I could laugh and say, you idiot, he's green," or say, "You're not a true fan of Ghostbusters," or I could say, I think I'm pretty sure he's green." And then we can go find out. We have the whole of human knowledge now in our pocket, and we can go look it up. But
Mhm,
the goal is not to prove that I'm right. The goal is to find out and to admit that you might be wrong, because I guarantee you there's going to come a time you're going to be in a spat with someone about something like this, and you're going to be 100% sure you're right. You're going to go look it up, and you will not be right.
100%
It
true.
will. I
Anyone
promise you.
anyone
So,
who's a parent, anyone like
yes.
yours, anyone who's a parent has
Uh-huh.
had that experience at least 50 times in the last week. Yes.
Absolutely. No, I'm pretty sure, and then you go look, "Oh, you know what? You were right. I well-read 5-year-old. Thank you." So if that's what we wanna see other people do, that's what we have to do
Mm.
constantly. because I can't make them be that way, but I can show them that it's okay to be wrong, and I don't get sick. I don't lose a hand, my hair doesn't fall out. I'm just wrong. It's okay to be wrong. It happens,
Is
and
there a
so
way is there a way that you've worked with teams or the companies that you work with ever maybe to talk with leadership, I would assume, about, failure as, as a part of the culture, about, being able to raise your hand and say, "You know what? Whoops." Like, "Hey guys, I was like being able to say that in and have it honored, have it like, so I've seen at some conferences, for example, something that would I know it is a fail fest, right? Where
Mhm.
we always go to a conference like ATD or EduCause or one of these things where everybody's like, "Oh, look at the great stuff we did." It's so rare that you go to a big place where you're surrounded by your peers that you want to be respected by, and you're like, "Guess what? Let me tell you about when I really screwed up." You know?
Mhm.
Are there other recipes that you might say in order to bring this into a culture?
Yeah, so, the let's look at what the science says about learning something, right?
Mhm.
So, what the most effective way to learn anything new is to practice it.
Mm,
That's the most effective way. So, if we wanna get better and more comfortable being wrong, we have to practice being wrong. And so we can start just by flipping a coin. You can have a coin and guess and call it in the air and then put it down on the table, and if you were wrong, you were wrong. It's completely low stakes, and people will argue and say like, "Well, this doesn't bother me being wrong here because there are no stakes." And that's the point. To show people that you can be wrong about a coin toss or a dice roll just as much as you can be wrong about, "You know what? I said that I should send that email at the end of the day instead of the beginning of the day. That ended up not being the right call." Because most of the time, the stakes aren't high.
mm,
Yes, there are absolutely times where mistakes have very high impact, but most of the time in the corporate world, when you are wrong about something, people might have to re-enter a few purchase orders or something, but,
right.
you know, we don't have to break out the blood bags, we don't have to, like, set any limbs. It's okay. And I think that a lot of people, their lizard brain doesn't know that or doesn't remember that, and they're just scared of being wrong, and it's
Mm.
okay.
Do you have any yeah, well, I'm not gonna ask that question. I'm gonna let that one I'll let that
Okay.
one slide. No, I was gonna is it do we find that people in positions of, y let's just say leadership of power, quote unquote, are they more susceptible to pseudoscience than others? Do we have any do we have anything around who has the proclivity to use pseudoscience more often than not? Or I'm just wondering, I'm trying to come up with a way to say, how do I smell it? How do I see it? And then, maybe not. Maybe we don't have any of this
Well,
information.
I do okay, so I'm gonna answer it in a couple of different ways. So, the first part is that I think the biggest corollary to being able to sniff out and debunk pseudoscience is data literacy. I think
Mm,
that's being educated on what good research looks like, what a sample size is, what statistical significance means. I think the more someone is educated about that, the better they are at recognizing it, and the better they are at being like, you know what? I may have been wrong about that. I need to do it a couple more times to see. I think like data literacy is one of the best ways to battle that. Um, the other thing I was going to say, what was I going to say? You were saying, oh, ways to sniff it out. Okay, so couple of different ways. The first way is if there are numbers where there shouldn't be numbers. That's a way to look at it because you'll see articles and stuff that says like this makes you 15% more empathetic.
mm,
Like how did they, and it's not to say that it's not true because they may have a very good operational definition in their research study and they did some very rigorous experiments with it, but if you see a number on something like empathy or happiness or anything like that, like I
effectiveness. Yeah, yeah,
effectiveness,
yeah.
more productive, like
Yeah.
how did you measure that? I want to know how do I have 15% more empathy units than the person next to me? So if you see numbers where there shouldn't be numbers, my most favorite example of that, I may burst the bubble of some people listening here, but the what is it? The 73855 rule? Is that it? The one that like 7% of your message is your words, 38% is your tone, and 55% is your body language. That one.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Anyways,
Yes.
so it's used a lot in communication training to say like, well, it's not just about the words that you use, it's about your body language and your tone, which is true. Those are very important. Albert Mehrabian did a study where he paired like facial expressions with sentences to show like what do you think the person was feeling, and he that was a statistic he threw out, but he said in this study, in this context, in this lab with these parameters, these are the percentages we got. He never said like this is how it is, but people have taken that statistic and run with it, saying like in your message 7% is just 7% is the words. Everything else, you can watch a TED talk with the sound off because
Right.
only 7% is the words. You should be able to pick up the rest of it. And Albert Mehrabian himself doesn't like the way that statistic is circulated. So, um, numbers where there shouldn't be numbers. That's one. Two, um, another piece that I like to talk about is what's called story shapes. You could thank Kurt Vonnegut and Neil Gaiman for the term story shapes. But basically, story shapes is any kind of story arc that we're familiar with. Anyone who went to school in the United States is familiar with the pyramid of like the rising action, the climax, and the falling action. That is a shape of story we are very familiar with. So much so that we can see it where it may not be there.
Mm.
When I talk about this, I like to throw optical illusion up on the wall and say, like, there's like pieces taken out of these circles. There's no actual triangle here, but your brain sees a triangle because that's what your brain is trying to fill in. And our brain will do the same thing with reality. We'll see a story where there's not really a story shape. So things like a bumblebee shouldn't be able to fly. But it was up on the wall at my eye doctor's office when I was a kid that by the laws of physics, a bumblebee shouldn't be able to fly, but it does because it doesn't know that. No one has ever told the bumblebee that it can't. Well, that's not true.
Yeah.
Bumblebees actually, if a bumblebee was human sized, yes, that would be a problem. But the bumblebee is this big, and it actually creates like little vortexes underneath itself. It's pretty cool. But a bumblebee is perfectly capable of flying. But that story that anecdote tells about defying the odds and cheering on the little guy is a really good story shape, and we want it to be true. So when you see anything in news or in your expository texts that is a little bit too story shaped, just
Mhm.
a little bit too story shaped, it's worth examining. Another big one that you come across is how our railroad tracks are like 4 feet 8 inches apart because they were built by British expats, and their railroad tracks were 4 feet 8 inches apart because the Roman chariots were 4 feet 8 inches apart, and that's a really cool story shape. And it's just too story shaped, and if you look into it, it turns out it's not true. So,
What is the real answer?
um, the coincidence. We didn't have a standard in the United States until after the Civil War. The British didn't have a standard, and the Romans definitely didn't have a standard. And a lot of times when you read that statistic, it says the Roman war chariots, and Romans didn't have
War
war
chariot.
chariots. That would be like saying America's war Chevy Camaros. Like they they use chariots for races. They didn't use them in war. So
I just gotta throw out another fact there too. There are places in the world, I believe, well, at least there were 20 years ago, where you can get on a train and go and, you actually have to stop, and they have to lift up the train
yep.
and put it onto a
Mhm.
different gauge track, mostly because the Soviet Union built tracks with one gauge, and the United States and the West built tracks with another gauge. And if you want to cross in between those two places, you got to do it. I got to do that in, I believe it was between Romania and Moldova, but super interesting stuff about how we do that, right?
I used to live on Long Island, and when you take a train into the city, if you're on a double decker, you have to stop and change somewhere because the tracks were not built for the height of the train past Jamaica Station. So,
Sure.
we barely have that sort of consistency here within one like 60-mile stretch. So, um, but again, it's that story that people love to tell, and it's an important story, which is don't do something away just because that's the way you've always done it. And that's a story that should be told, but we need to find true anecdotes because a lot of times life is not that story shaped.
Abby Cooke, you have been absolutely delightful. I've loved this conversation.
Thank
Miss
you.
Lizard, how should people find you if they want to know more about pseudoscience busting, but also about the kind of training that you do and the
Mhm.
types of work that you deliver?
Sure. So, probably I aggregate all of my contact stuff on lizardbrainlearning.com. You can also search for Ms. Lizard on TikTok, MIZ Lizard. I'm on there. I'm actually quite active on TikTok. There's a blog on lizardbrainlearning.com. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I say yes to just about everybody because I enjoy seeing what people do and where they're from and things like that. So, um, come and say hi.
Ah, fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your super busy schedule today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ladek. Have a good one.